paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
The truth.
Hi, my name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to my podcast. My guest today is Jean Hargadon-Wehner, and she has written a book called Walking with Aletheia, and it's about her journey to healing after extreme abuse in her childhood. And I'd like to say hello, Jean.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right.
Good, good. Could you give us a little background about your early life?
Sure. Well, I grew up. We lived in Baltimore, Maryland. Good portion of my youth was in an row home. There were, by the time we moved, 9 children, and my mom and dad. My dad was a policeman. My mom was a homemaker. We were a good Catholic Irish family. And I had, once there were 10 of us all together when we moved, Mom had one more child. There were 3 boys before me, then me, and 3 boys after me. Then there were 2 girls that came along and a little boy. We didn't have a whole lot, but we had a lot. We had friends with each other. We had a neighborhood of friends. Once we moved, we also had that continued on. And it was a good family that we all felt our parents were present to the best of their ability, and didn't have a lot of money to do a huge amount of things with, but you wouldn't know it. We really did. We were very involved with church. We were involved with school, and we were involved in family. So it was a good upbringing.
Your abuse initially started at a very young age with your uncle and his cronies.
Right.
I believe you were at 3 years old at that time.
Well, I was 3 when it began with him. We would go to my aunt and uncles. They were our great aunt and uncle, my mom's aunt and uncle. And we would go for a weekend, and it would be whoever was over 3 or 3 and older, because that was just the rule. And so we would go maybe 2 times a year. I don't know, maybe 3, but it would be for a weekend. The younger ones would be at home, and it was a break for them. And we got to do a lot of things. My aunt and uncle had no children, so it was a fun weekend away. A lot of those fun things like a grandparent would do if you went away. My uncle, he was a drinker, and my aunt used to be, my mom told me after I remembered these things and we talked, and she was recovered alcoholic. And my mom felt very much that she, who was her favorite aunt, she felt that she was able to take care of things, that she had a handle on things, never ever thinking there was anything other than, beer drinking. That's what most people in that day did they didn't go out to a pub, or they didn't go sit in Geno's, or they sat in their backyard and had a couple cold beers. So he began slowly doing what I now understand was grooming, doing that, just different things as I would be there. And I would have the memory would come very sporadically, very unexpectedly, but it happened over a course of time. Then he began to take me while the kids, the other ones, would be out in the yard playing, because they always had a playtime in the yard. And he would take me in the basement and he would abuse me there. And then as I got a little older, I would say maybe, I was only there between the ages of 3 and 12. And probably, I don't know what, maybe after 8 or 9 is, I don't have a real timeline put together. But we would always stop at this bar called the Green Door, and we would get sodas on our Sunday ride home. And I started to remember that he would take me in the back room of the, just slip me in and let whoever, I don't, molest me, touch me, fondle me. And then I stopped going at the age of 12 and never was able to tell anybody, but I don't know that I ever thought it was unusual for his house. It's strange when you do start having people touch you in ways that it just seems like that's what they do. No one talked about sex. No one talked about good touch, bad touch. It was just what happened when I would be there. And yeah, I stopped at the age of 12 because I had an experience there where I had gotten my first period, and he found out and was very angry, and I became hysterical, and I just never went again, to my recollection and to what I think others have remembered too.
You were integral to The Keepers, which was a docuseries that ran on Netflix about, it started out about the death of a nun, but as it got deeper and deeper, there was a pedophile network that was the cause of her being murdered. And you went to this school, Archbishop Keough, where that nun, Sister Cathy Cesnik, taught. And then your abuse continued there, first by a Father Magnus, and then by and I hate to call these guys fathers, but by Magnus and Maskell.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to talk about that a little bit, when that started to happen?
Yeah, I was probably around 14. I didn't want to go to that school. I wanted to go to that was all girls Catholic high school. And like I said, my parents were good Catholics, and the whole family was. And they wanted me, it was in walking distance too, which made a big difference with a big family with one car. So it was worth it to them to have me go there instead of the trade school that I wanted to go to. So I feel, again, remembering things is different than if you always remembered. But I was about 14, so it might have been around the end of my freshman year, and I remember going to the confessional, and I had always remembered that I went to confession there. So this was interesting. I had always remembered that it took me 5 tries to go in, that when I finally did go in, I shared what it was I needed to share that I felt guilty about. And the priest, I always knew it was Magnus, and that he had asked, normally at that time, the priest would look forward. There would be some kind of screen or something that would be between the person who was confessing. They would be facing like the side of his head. And so I always remembered that he had asked me, can I look at you, and what is your name? And I had done work all around how guilty I must have felt, that I had done something so horrible that he had to do that. So it was part of what I had been working with as something I remembered. So all of a sudden, I began remembering in 1992, a continuation of that experience in the confessional, and ending with Magnus, and I agree with you, it's Magnus and Maskell. I don't even like giving them their first names, other than if I say Neil Magnus and somebody knew Neil Magnus and he did something, please, know that's who it is. And Joseph Maskell. So what happened is that he ultimately blackmailed me at that point. He told me that what I had shared with him, God could not forgive, and he would have to spend a whole lot more time praying about it, and he would need to see me again. And that began the process of this counseling. And no one knew. I was told when to be at his office. I went any X amount of times. And the next thing you know, Maskell is invited in. Then there were a number of times where both of these priests were sexually abusing me. And all of it with this disguise of where he got me from. So everything for me revolved around this longing for forgiveness for something that I believed as a Catholic I would get if I went to them. So there was a tie. I was tied to my faith. I was tied to this belief that forgiveness was most important. And I was tied to the idea that these men were the ones who were going to be the only ones who could give it to me. And so innocently, I did what I was told. At that age, extremely naive. So shortly after that, sometime later, I began going to Maskell's. Maskell was the chaplain of Archbishop Keough, and Magnus was the director of religion at Archbishop Keough. And so I know that I began going to Maskell's chaplain's office. I was told what day to be there and what time. And I realized as I remembered more, that's why I was never called over the loudspeaker. It was so infested within the school that there were girls being called over the loudspeaker that were to go to see Maskell. And I always thought it was really kind of interesting. I don't remember being called over the loudspeaker. And I understand now that it's because he had set it up and it was private. It was secret. My parents had no idea I was going. People in the office obviously did. People in the first floor had to have. But it was something that continued on. Next thing you know, I would go to the chaplain's office and there'd be someone else in the room. And within the school, I was abused up until the end of my years there. Slowly, I was blocking it out. I was dissociating from it. He was also using, he was very immersed in psychology. So he was also using hypnosis. When I started remembering, I felt it right away. I would leave, there was something terrible I would remember all of a sudden, and then I would leave the room and I'd hear a click of the door and everything would just blank out. Or he would say a phrase, I only want what's best for you, just what's best for you, and everything would just stop. I can feel it in my body, it just stops. So I know he was using a brainwashing, let's say techniques. And so by the time I graduated from there, I had been so traumatized and so manipulated and so raped on body, mind, and spirit levels that I literally just severed from that ever even happening. And I didn't begin remembering my uncle until I was 27. And I didn't begin remembering the priest until 1992. And that brought up the whole issue of repressed memories. In 1992, I don't have a big profession. I never did. I never made a lot of money. I was always trying to figure myself out. I was a good person. I loved my kids. I was a good mom. But when it came to that, it just seemed I'm the only one out of the 10 that does not have a college education. I've tried, and it was just, it was never, I always thought I was stupid. So in 1992, I just finished a spiritual directing program of 4 years. I had a spiritual director for 11 years, Brother Richard Brees, a Catholic brother of the Christian brother community. I had been a major part of my church. I was very active, my husband and I and the kids, Catholic. And so I was going to be a spiritual director. I was going to the religious ed instructor up at my church to talk about how do you charge people for it when it's something that people tell you have a gift at. So I was really working at this, and I kept feeling like I couldn't do it. I couldn't understand why, but I just felt like I kept hitting something. I began to remember on the tail end, at one point, I'm going to be a little jumpy, but I just need to say the memories of my uncle started already. I had already done 10 years of working out my uncle and how those memories would come up. They almost feel as if they drop into your brain. It is as if they're pieces of a puzzle. And so all of a sudden there is this another part of it. It'll feel as if you're going through it for the first time, that you are that little girl, you are that teenager, you are in that experience for the very first time. So I had already had the experience of working with therapy and spiritual director and certain family members, my uncle's abuse on me, and I was ready to move forward. So when I started to feel something was coming, is what I say, I let it, because I would let it and then I would discern it. I would figure out later. I had people in place. And I will say, I think it's important you have people in place. I don't think you just start doing this thing on your own willy-nilly, because it can take you on a terrible tailspin, and you want people in place. So I call it throwing up memories. I had this bout of throwing up memories of my uncle in the back of that bar, taking me to let people do to me what they were doing. It was the first time I remembered that. On the tail end of it was the next part of of Magnus in the confessional, which shocked me, but it freed me. I thought, this is why I can't move forward. I needed to know the rest of that memory. But as time moved on, I started remembering more. And one of the things that happened was in January of 1993, the Archdiocese was telling me if I don't give them corroboration, the name of someone else, that Maskell, who had been taken to a facility in order
forward at that point.
What?
You had come forward at that point and told.
I had come forward to the Archdiocese.
Yes.
I had come forward to the Archdiocese in, I came forward to my pastor in, I guess it was May of 1992 when I started to remember, because I couldn't do the Eucharistic ministry job that I was in. I couldn't go to church. You'd have to be in a person's body when this just comes out of the blue. I was in shock. I was an adult woman who thought I knew myself, with the feeling of a little girl who was saying, I want to tell you something. And when it would happen, I'm in it. I am experiencing it. And then I think, I must be crazy. I must not only be crazy, I must not want to step out in a job, because now I've found a great thing that's going to keep me from doing that. And so I had to go and talk to my pastor, because it was like, I got to tell you why I'm not here. And that grew into talking to the archdiocese, which ended up with 2 meetings with them, where I made statements about Maskell. By that point, 1992, Magnus was dead. And Maskell was a pastor of a church down in Baltimore City. So I talked to them. I went and gave them a written statement. And then I thought that would be it. They would take care of it. Well, that wasn't enough. I began remembering adults. That's when I started remembering adults who were in the room or had been putting hands on me with Maskell there. And so I went down and I told them that. I had 2 meetings with them. He, at that point, had been taken to some facility for counseling, or whatever they do. I think he played golf, a lot. But that's my own personal. No one ever said that. But I do feel that at that point then, in that January, they said, we have nothing more to keep him here. We're not seeing anything that connects the dots. We need corroboration, or we have to let him out. So I got together with a friend. And when I got together with a friend, she brought a yearbook. But it was a yearbook of 2 years before we graduated, which I wouldn't have had. It was 1969. I graduated in 1971. So I saw a picture of Cathy Cesnik. It started to stir that feeling down deep, like, oh, something's coming, something's coming. I began to remember a horrible feeling that I loved her and I killed her. I loved her and I killed her. I loved her and I killed her. So in order to figure out, I really believed I killed her. And so here I was now with a lawyer, Phil Dantes and his firm, because the archdiocese told me that I needed to have a lawyer. What I had remembered when I had that feeling was that I had gone into her classroom. I got a book and she was in there. And it was at the end of, it was last day of school. It's what my feeling is. And she started talking to me, and she was asking me questions about how do I like the school? What was I doing? Did I enjoy it? Did I have a good year? And I just was very nonchalant. I didn't want to talk about it. And I really didn't like the school. And what I'm saying is as the adult, this didn't make any sense to me, because I didn't think I had her as a teacher. I couldn't figure out, why am I going in her room to get a book? And yet I went with it because I'm in it. It's happening. That's what I'm saying about these memories. It's there. I couldn't have made that up if I wanted to, because I had no clue that I had her as a teacher. So, and she seemed to be able to talk to me. I was talking to her. I couldn't figure that out either. It was so out of the memories I'd had up until then. It didn't make any sense. But I there I was doing it. So she had asked me, why I didn't like school. And I said I didn't want to talk about it. And I couldn't talk about it. I didn't want it. And so then she persisted and said, well, you don't need to talk. Why don't I ask you questions and you nod your head? And I said, okay. And she then asked, is there somebody making you do something you don't want to do? And I nodded my head, yes. And she said, would it be somebody who I would be acquainted with? And I nodded my head yes. And the whole time I'm looking down at the floor, like, and then she said, what is it the priest? And I looked up and I nodded my head yes. And she said, Jesus, I thought so. I thought as much. And she hugged me. And she said, not to worry about it, that she was going to take care of it, to go have a good summer, and she was going to take care of it. So I did. As far as I know, I don't remember a whole lot in betweens. I don't remember a whole lot in between, but I do know that I went back to the school in the next year, and there was the first time, probably the only time that I remember so far, that I was called over the loudspeaker. I found out that she wasn't there. Now, I can't tell you, did I already know? I can't tell you that I can't tell you what I knew. I can't tell you what I knew other than what I remember. So I remember being aware that she wasn't there and being very disappointed about that. And then at some point being called over the loudspeaker to go to Maskell's office. And so it was interesting because the memories, what was starting to happen was that, so then I get called to his office and he proceeds to tell me that somebody approached him during the summer and said that he was hurting the girls. And he said, you wouldn't have said that, would you? And of course, I was beyond, I don't even know how I was in the saying, I can't even believe I was in this room with this man. That's why I had hoped that they would just find out I was crazy. This stuff, I couldn't have made it up if I wanted to. And the things that they did when it came out of my mouth, when I would tell them, the archdiocese representatives or the police or the lawyers, I felt like it was somebody else saying it. It couldn't have been me. I didn't know the things I was saying that they were doing. I was like, how could that have happened? And I didn't know it. So I was in my own little whirlwind when all this is going on. And my friend then has brought the book. I start to have this memory of loving her and killing her. Then I proceed to remember being taken to see her body by Maskell. And I remembered that he had called me to his office, or he told me to be there after school. And again, she was missing. I have no idea. Did I know that? I have no idea. It's blank. It's just a big blank slate, except for what I remember. And so I remember him saying that he knew where she was and how I was very relieved and excited, and he knew where she was. And so he said, I'll take you to her. So I was under the impression, I can feel it in the memory, that she was alive. It wasn't anything about it that made me think. I had no feeling whatsoever other than, I have nothing other than that. Why would I, So then he took me for this ride. He would normally talk as if he were giving a sermon. So he would be talking and talking and talking, about people who lied and why it was important to tell the truth, and this rhetoric. So we go down through these woods, and I'm thinking, why are we going here? Why would she be here? There's no houses, there's no people. And he comes down to a spot and he stops, and we get out, and he's walking in front of me. It's not very far. All of a sudden he moves over, and I'm thinking, where is she? And then I noticed this heap on the ground, and I went running over. and I knelt down, and her head was laying to the right and her head was up the left. And there were maggots, and I was rubbing her face and saying, please help me, please help me, please help me. And he came down behind me and he said, you see what happens when you say bad things about people? And I just froze. I sat back and I was looking at my hands, and he said, now I gotta protect you. I gotta make sure no one finds out what you did. He started right away. The brainwashing was unbelievable, what this man was capable of. And my concern is what he mentored others to be capable of. See, that this didn't happen in a shoebox. This happened in a school where people were allowing this behavior to go on and turn blind eyes, and there were other people involved. And there were other people who were given permission by a priest who was in their minds the authority of their faith also. And I suspect some were picked up out of a confessional as well. And some were just the nature of the beast. So he proceeded to talk about how he had to protect me, and now he had to make sure no one found out what I did. And my memory, and I told them this then, and was that there was a dumpster and he had lifted the top, he had on gloves, he picked her up and put her in it. And I was just kneeling there looking at my hands. And then he said, get up, get in the car. And so I got in the car, and the whole ride, he was first time he gave me a napkin to wipe my hands. And I was really aware of that because people have been ejaculating on me, in me, and I was never given anything to wipe off with. If it went on the floor, I was to wipe that up. So he drives me to, never did, and I have no memory of him ever taking me home. Other survivors of the school remember their parents even knowing that he was seeing them. And he would pick them up at their houses. Never. It was always 2 blocks over that I remember so far, or up on the main street. And he would drop me off. And he that time said, I'm going to have to figure out what I got to do in order to keep you safe. I'm going to make sure, I got to now make sure nobody finds out what you did. Already had started this, and I was in pure shock. So that's what I remembered of that memory. And my sister was with me when I remembered. I very seldom have anyone with me when I have memories surface. It's a very vulnerable place to be. Other survivors will know that. And I need to plug in with somebody because I'm in the experience. So I would get my husband on the phone and say, talk to me. Or I'd get my sister on the phone and they would talk me back up off of the ground. And then I would take it to a therapist and I would do whatever I had to do. But so that was how I remembered being taken to Cathy Cesnik's body, and Maskell being the person who took me there.
The police said that there possibly couldn't be maggots because it was January, and then the autopsy report got buried, and then once it was released, it said that she had maggots on her mouth, and,
right.
So you were vindicated, but it took many years for that autopsy report to be released, and that's just one point that at that point Maskell could have been stopped, but because the police covered it up for him, the Baltimore police and who knows who else, because there were police involved with this, and at least one physician and also a politician that we know of. There were others,
right.
But that's what they used to discredit you, even though it was right there on the autopsy report. So you had these memories and you went to the police and you were essentially ignored. You did get some lawyers, and I guess, and then your lawyers were able to, you've got another, you were Jane Doe, but then a Jane Roe came on, another Keough classmate, but I guess 30 to 40 other Keough classmates came forward at that point. And how did you feel at that point? You're no longer doing this by yourself. There are other victims of these sadists.
I didn't believe it. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I was in my own little hellhole, and I didn't believe it. I was still in shock. I was numb. I was a victim, sitting in an adult woman's body, talking as if I should know what I'm talking about. I first had gone to the Archdiocese. I had a lawyer when I went to the Archdiocese. It was supposed to be, we were fine with each other. We fired that lawyer after the 2 meetings with the Archdiocese. They told me to get another lawyer. I got another lawyer, and this lawyer is where the police came in. So that was when, and I can't even tell you what that was like because I was in such shock. I was a victim. I'm still remembering. So it isn't like you remember and all of a sudden now you've remembered it. I'm remembering as I'm talking to these people. And I am doubting and questioning my own self the entire way. So it was interesting to have at some point, so they didn't tell me a whole lot. I didn't want to hear a whole lot. Like I shared, I didn't want anything to the defense, though, the prosecuting lawyers were very intent on, did I make this up? Did I read a book that would make me think these things? Did a therapist say these things to me? And so then I started believing that's what it was that it was very interesting. I became, as the adult, trying very hard not to do those things because I then thought, maybe I'm making this up. Maybe someone did, make a statement that I grabbed hold of. So even when Teresa came forward and those other ones came forward, I didn't know what they were saying. I had no idea if they were talking the same extent of this craziness or was it other things. So I wasn't being told a whole lot. I didn't even know it was that many. I was busy doing my inner work. I was busy trying to stay somehow connected to my family because I was beside myself. I was living a walking hell. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. It had to sink in just like memories had to sink in. I had no foundation, and my foundation, that was my faith system, shattered. It was just shattered. I didn't have that to lean on because now I'm remembering people who were representing that faith system doing these horrific things to this young girl. And I thought, what am I believing in? What is it that I believe in? And having the Archdiocese not take any responsibility nor grab the ball and run with it, which I thought they were going to do. So it was this horrible thing that was happening where everything became empty. And all I had was this abyss that I was standing on the edge of, waiting for more shit to just come up and smack me in the face. And not understanding that how this could have happened and why was not somebody taking care of it? That's the thing. I just didn't understand why. I had been a part of a prayer group. There were priests who were involved in that prayer group. I couldn't understand. People knew me. And it just didn't, none of it made sense. I was trying to make sense out of the senseless. There was no, I was exhausted. I was exhausted. So when it did come to the point where I became Jane Doe, I was asked, Now, let me just say this. I was asked by my lawyers. So I came forward with the Archdiocese in 1992. I remembered Cathy Cesnik, which changed the whole dynamic because now I remembered a woman who had been murdered and it was a cold case murder. So when I have new lawyers, I'm remembering a murder. They reinvestigated. They opened everything back up. So what happens with all of this is that at a certain point, the church decides they are going to put him back in a parish. At that point is when the lawyers I was with had sent out an ad in the paper, had sent what my whole family sent out letters to the alumni to see if anybody knew of any inappropriate behavior. And that's where the people started coming forward. And you have to remember, it wasn't text going on or emails going on. There were phone booths that they were calling from. They were sending note cards. I believe faxes were at that point. I'm not really sure. There was no email. So the people who did come forward, that's just the ones that had the courage to write something. I can't imagine the ones that didn't. So with that, now I know that they're asking me, will you go forward with a lawsuit? My lawyers are asking me that. I also know that the church is saying we need to put him back in a parish because there's nothing to validate what you're saying. And two things were happening. One was I wanted it all to be over. I mean, I literally, every step of the way it was, does it still feel like the right thing to do? Because I wanted it to be over. I wanted to stop. I never wanted to go that far. And now I was aware that he was going to be out. I had said all these things, Nick. I had said all these things. And this man was going to be back out. And he was going to be at a parish that wasn't a whole heck of a lot far from my house. So I had that terror of that kid in me. And the adult who was like, what I remembered these other adults. I've told people in this, The other thing is that the statute of limitations is extremely important at this point. When I left Keough, what I found out through this was that the statute of limitations allowed me 3 years from when I left Keough to report it. And if I didn't report it in those 3 years, then I had no legal right to sue or call these predators, these perpetrators, to any kind of court. What was happening is this is how real these memories, this breakthrough was. I felt I was in my 3-year statute of limitations time limit. I felt like I had started remembering, I started living what happened to me when I left that school in 1992. And everything that was happening was as if I were living it for the first time. So I believed I was in my 3-year trial period, whatever that period is, they call that. I felt as an adult that made perfect sense. I was in it. And so for 2 reasons, I said yes to the lawsuit. That I was terrified that now I said these things and they're putting him back in a parish. And I was afraid for other children. But I also felt I was legitimately in my 3-year statute period. And then that's when Teresa came forward with those notes that went out. This is when they had those people from cards. And I became Jane Doe and she became Jane Roe. And we went forward to sue the Archdiocese and the School Sisters of Notre Dame.
The really nefarious thing about this, well, everything's nefarious about it, but they wanted you to name victims that could corroborate you. And in 1967, Charles Franz came forward and said that he'd been molested by Maskell. And he said, and he described a very nasty, sadistic guy like you did. And what they did is they moved Maskell to your school. I mean,
Right.
Just
Right.
they didn't move him to Timbuktu. They didn't move him to Venezuela. They didn't move him to Alaska. They moved him right across town, which I still find mind-boggling. And then they wanted corroboration from you. So at this point, we see a lot of malfeasance. You had said that there were maggots on Cathy's face, and the police said no. But in fact, they were sitting on an autopsy report that said that there were maggots in Cathy's mouth. The church had a victim had come forward in 1967, a very genuine victim, and they just moved Maskell. And then there was this deluge of people that came forward that said that they've been molested at Keough. And according to the police officer that wanted anonymity, he said up to 100 victims came forward. And Sharon May, the state prosecutor, did not prosecute on those because she said she didn't have the evidence to prosecute. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of malfeasance to cover this up already. And then you ultimately got to 2016 where you reached an accord with the church.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was the lawsuit itself, being in the courtroom was, I had 21 hours of depositions. And that was torturous. I mean, it really was. You have to remember again, I can only tell what I remember at this point, even now. And so I'm saying things that I remembered, and they wanted me to expand on it. So here I am, a grown woman saying, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I understand why people don't come forward. It's like, I don't know. I can only tell you what I know. That's all I know. So I was looked at like I was crazy. When I did talk to the police, I wasn't a good solid memory. I was just remembering, and I was remembering the way that my mind could allow me to get that information. And it didn't come out of me the way that it would come out of you. If it was like, I took a walk in the park when I was 10, and then I, bumped into my mother, and I thought, oh my gosh, one's supposed to be in the park, and now my mother's standing in front of me. It's not that. And so they all made me feel a little bit like I was stupid. Like, why can't you give us more? So I should never have been in that situation to begin with without some kind of advocate sitting next to me. If anybody ever comes forward with that kind of bits and pieces of memory, take someone with you. Mike was with me, my husband, but he was told that he could be in the room as long as he didn't open his mouth. Because if he opened his mouth, he had to leave. And Mike knew if he left, I left. So I at least had that. And Mike was a person that didn't understand what I was going through, but he trusted me. And that made all the difference. So I do feel that when I went into the courtroom, that was my first experience, Nick, of where I could say, I always knew I was extremely afraid. Always, even before I remembered, I just stayed in my own little spaces. And I didn't want to go outside of that. Now I understand it was instilled in me. This terror was instilled in me. It's almost like on a cellular level. And I work with it. I work with it a lot. I'm sitting here because I'm working with it. But when I went into the courtroom as Jane Doe, one of the things that I felt, and I felt it in my whole being, was that it was the first time that I experienced moving into that fear. And somehow it became courage. I always remember the feeling of it was like two sides of a coin. Couldn't figure out where one turned into the other. but I felt like that was my first experience of courage, that something about this was courageous. So that was a powerful wow that I didn't get until years later. When it comes to moving through that and then coming to this idea, this mediation, I felt like the mediation was more of a PR, it was a PR move, I think, for the Archdiocese. We got, different people got different amounts. I went purposely to support as corroboration. I had heard there were 12 other people who were mediating. And I thought, well, I'll go and I'll say all the things that had happened so that if they say any of those things, it'll corroborate it. Because I make a point that I don't spend a lot of time with a lot of alumni. I'm always afraid that they might say something that's going to trigger a memory. I'm also very sensitive to the fact that I may have introduced people to that room because that's what he ultimately had you do. And that just upsets me. So I kind of still am working on that. But with the mediation, I did what I wanted to do. I wanted to dust my feet. I wanted to take my power back, which I lost. It was another traumatizing with the lawsuit. And I also, I felt like I could corroborate the other people. The one thing that I would say is that it felt pastorally empty. It also felt like they had a limit already in their mind and they stuck to it, and that's fine. I was there 5 hours. I had my son, my daughter, my brother, Ed. I had people with me. I had my therapist come the first, we were 2 meetings. But the other thing is that there was money they would split, and one was for, I don't know, they wouldn't call it compensation because they weren't admitting that it ever happened. It was alleged. And then the other was for therapies. And I didn't want their hands. I was dusting my feet. I didn't want them anywhere near this money. So I asked if they would do a health savings account where they could still have control of the money, but I didn't have to send bills or receipts, or I didn't have to talk to anybody. I could just use the health savings account. They would have control of it and we could work it that way. And they said no. So I left some money on the table because I hadn't had their hands in my therapy up until then, which was 20 some years. And I wasn't about to start now. I didn't want them anywhere near me. So it was very healing, but it was not what I thought it was going to be.
Can you tell us about your journey to healing and writing the book, Walking with Aletheia, the Greek goddess of truth?
My journey, I would say, she is a part of. The healing has been going on back when it all intertwines. My uncle, my own spiritual growth, remembering the priest and what else went on, my faith, how that shifted. So I would say there are certain people who have been extremely important, and I would encourage survivors to consider. And it's almost like it's this tapestry, I find it ironic that Brother Richard, who was a Christian brother, had been my spiritual director through the beginnings, remembering my uncle and the beginnings of remembering these priests, that he was instrumental as someone who was of my faith to help me remember things that clergy did to me. I also find that spiritual directing started way back in 1980, maybe 1979. And it was a priest who originally encouraged me to journal. And then when I started with Brother Richard, he, as a spiritual director, that was one of the tools. So tools like prayer, journaling, meditation. I call it my quiet, which is a combination of all those things. Bringing also into that the people that might be, massage therapist, talk therapy. It could be a psychiatrist. It might be friend, family. There was, for me, that became key. The people who I could trust that they could be there with the other things that were going on. That's a big part of my healing process. The journaling became very important. It was, the way I was taught journaling was it's a lot of dialoguing, a lot of free flow writing. So I had 4 years of learning how to journal. And so it's a lot of letting kind of like the subconscious just kind of flow. You have to get into that mode. You just kind of move with it. And then you start dialoguing. You might dialogue with yourself and different, a child within. You might dialogue with others, mother, father, might dialogue with God. But there was a lot of internal, unthought of information or activity that was coming out your hand onto paper. So I had quite a few journals, and I had journaled a lot. So that was a major part of my healing. In those dialogues, or in that deep quiet, that meditation, I began to become aware of spirit guides. I can't say are my imagination, because I feel in some way they were organically present even when I was young. So I can't label them, but I do know that they have been extremely present, extremely helpful, and have been a big part of my healing. In those deeper journeys, that psychological and spiritual process, which is why I wrote Walking with Aletheia, I became aware of these aspects, these little parts of myself, and I call it my personas. And different ones held different traumas. And it's been a real process of coming to find them, know them, connect with them, befriend them, and then integrate with them. And finding that I'm always shocked when they're me, and to realize they're me. And so that's been a big part of my healing. When Aletheia was introduced, my son had carved a carving of the Greek goddess of truth. And it was after The Keepers was done filming, and we were here one evening, and he presented it to Ryan White, Jessica Hargrave, and John Benham, who were the filming team. And he said that he felt that was what they were for me and for others, this goddess of truth. And Aletheia holds a mirror up. That's her like mascot. And so she mirrors back the truth of what you see. And you can deny it, or you can pretend it's not there. You can go back to sleep. But the mirror doesn't lie. It's what you see. It's what's there. So that is really what I feel she brought. And I started to realize that throughout my healing process, my journey, this whole walk, people have been mirroring back to me what they saw. And they would see someone they trusted, or they would see someone who was innocent, or they would see somebody who was courageous. I never felt that. I still struggle with that, but they mirrored it back to me over and over and over again. And I began to see me in a different way. And in seeing me, I could start finding me and bringing more of me to the surface, more of me to be a part of what I was seeing, because some things were missing. And that was a big part of the journey. So even with the title, it is Walking with Truth, not kicking it under a rug, not turning a blind eye, not calling it what's more comfortable, not acting like I shouldn't say this because nobody else is saying it, but finding the courage to lean into that fear and speak truth to power, to speak truth to yourself, to speak truth to Nick, to speak truth to Ryan and Jess, and walk away feeling like if only people had spoken truth when I was in the middle of some really horrific situations, something might have stopped. Cathy tried to, and she ended up dead. And I feel like it's not easy, but I feel like that's what I try to do, is walk with the truth to the best of my ability.
How big was the Keepers in helping you heal? Was that a positive process for you?
The Keepers, after the courts decided that they could not scientifically say that repressed memories was legitimate, was real, everything stopped. Well, as the adult, I was waiting for the church to legitimize me or support me. I was waiting for the courts to legitimize me, to support me. I was waiting for the police department to do those things, because as the adult, I'm having my own little, crisis, this nut fest, and they didn't. So that took everything to a real slow movement. I went back under. I felt I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have stayed quiet. I should never have told the secret. So my healing process was stifled. It was like they threw a wrench into it. So 20 years I was silenced, is the way I feel. When Ryan came to me, Ryan was someone who was saying, not just, we want to find out who killed Cathy Cesnik, but we want to show how this abuse in its fullness to our best ability was going on, and let the audience decide, could it have had anything with this woman's death? And we'll give as much information as we can with that, and let the audience decide. Let people decide. I had accelerated in my healing at this point. The reason it started accelerating is because, first and foremost, I vetted the heck out of them. They came here and we had a 6-hour meeting. I had my confidants, some of my confidants were here. After we talked, I wanted to make sure that he understood I wouldn't be a part of anything that was going to be tantalizing, sensationalizing, girls gone wild, because I made it really clear, and you may know this from people who you've spoken with, you have to give some of the crime, the criminal activity, and it's not pretty. And it can actually be things that some people, that's what they look at to get turned on, This is the thing. It's like, in order to understand the crime, you have to explain some of that behavior. And I know that it could be misused, misrepresented. And so it was very important that I made that very clear with other people around. And after we had our talk, he told me later that when they got to the elevator, they both looked at each other and said, I want to do this. If she does it, I want to do this. So I, for the first time, felt like somebody was listening. For the first time, I felt like I could talk about things that have stayed in deposition files and have stayed in records. No one ever, the church never brought any of that out to discuss, to talk about. That man, after the courts, he walked free. He was in his 50s. I ended up in there by a fluke of nature because I went to my pastor. I was not going to report. I was in my own hell. We were in there, a fluke of nature. And he walked free, went to Ireland, And all the archdiocese could say is, we washed our hands of him. He's doing counseling in Ireland. It was like, this is something's not right with this picture. So what it brought back to me is that I was the wrong one, that I opened my mouth. I shouldn't have. Well, when I sat with Ryan and Jess, I could say whatever, as much as I wanted, and I introduced them to all my confidants. If they wanted to meet him, all my family, if they wanted to meet them, say whatever you have to say. You've kept my secret. You've listened to my cries. If you want to talk about what that felt like, talk to them about it. They opened the door to me using my voice. And no matter how afraid I am, if I can keep using my voice, I can keep supporting and advocating for others and for that part of myself. And that's what they did, which was really pretty powerful. And it went worldwide. And I will say it went worldwide. I was a basket case. I was off the grid. But that's not to hear from people I still hear from people from other countries. So do other survivors who were on the Keepers. I still hear from people, and they hear from people who just watched it for the first time. It's a 5-year anniversary this May. So it is amazing what this, and that came out in May 19th, I believe it was, it aired. The Me Too movement started at its real burst. That was October. I believe the woman who had started that had been doing it, but it was the first that somebody grabbed hold and said, let's put this on Facebook. Let's put it out in social media. So I feel like something was happening that was powerful with this. You know, I think it was what was Spotlight was right before with Boston. So what do you end up with? A bunch of survivors who are supporting survivors, and all the people that are supposed to be able to stand up then and say, yeah, I know, I believe you, I'll support you, did nothing. And we're still survivors supporting survivors.
Walking with Aletheia, was that a difficult process?
Writing the book?
Writing the book.
Writing the book was, well, I'll tell you, difficult is always an unusual word. It's like, it was hard, you know, I mean, because things are difficult. It was hard. It was 3.5 years. We had a focal group that we pulled together. It was 1 year after the Keepers. I was finally feeling a little grounded. We pulled a focus group together of a variety of different kinds of people to see if they thought, coming from where they were coming from, that anybody would be interested in reading about my inner journey, the spiritual psychological part of the movement as well. And all of them separately said yes, they did. So my brother Ed is a retired judge, and he said he wanted to work with me and that he would do the editing, because I'm good at speaking, but writing is not my forte. And so he began working with me, and memories have come up through this because of that. I found that my journals, I have a huge box of them. Some I even burned after the lawyers for the archdiocese insisted on seeing them. But I have a whole box of them. And I'll tell you what, instead of researching by going to the library in order to look up all kinds of other things, I went to my journals, and they were my little library. And so all these journals, all this experience, what I write about is what I wrote about. I had it all move me. You know, if I remembered things, I'd sit down and write it out. I am very experiential. I'm very visual. I find that reading and writing and speaking are a really big way that I communicate to myself and to others. So what happened was, I think I wrote a master journal, and that's Walking with Aletheia. And it was another whole level of of this healing process. But by pulling things together, it's another integrating pieces and putting it all together. I can't tell you that I've ever felt as light as I feel now, as free as I feel now. It took me into a new level of that also, which is how I discern what's the fruits of it. Did it make me feel worse? Did I end up in a hospital? Did I end up, not that that would be bad, but ultimately after the struggle of it and the work of it, I feel lighter, I feel freer, I feel more integrated, I feel more ready to go back to seeing what else is there that I got to do yet.
You're the fifth person, the fifth guest on my podcast. And my first guest she was a victim of a book that I wrote, The Franklin Scandal, of that network, which was covered up by federal and state law enforcement. And then had a guest who was an Epstein survivor, and that was covered up by federal and state law enforcement. And then I had a journalist who'd written something about the Finders, which I'd written a little about, and another network that was abusing children, and that was covered up by federal authorities. With your case, we see the Catholic Church covering it up, and we definitely see the Baltimore police covering it up. And it could have been covered up on a higher level. I don't think we know whether or not it has been. But these cover-ups of child abuse by authorities that are supposed to protect our children, do you have any thoughts about that? Or
I think I have a lot of thoughts about it. Whether or not they're just my thoughts is another story. There are a good deal of people who were involved in this. They were involved in different ways. They were involved. I feel you collude with a perpetrator when you turn a blind eye. He knows you've turned a blind eye. So these are not people, perpetrators aren't people who are going to admit once you address them, oh yeah, I've been doing that. What they tend to do, at least from my experience, is they start to protect themselves. And the more they do that, the more they do that. And the protection can be holding it over your head. And it can be where you don't even have to have them threaten you or blackmail you. You just know that they saw you turn a blind eye. So for me, I think there are an awful lot of people who think that they can get away with doing one thing. I only did one thing. I only saw him do that one time. And the truth is you become a part of his system, her system. And I think the police, I think that the members of the Catholic hierarchy, I think the politicians to a certain degree, depending on, whatever their knowledge is of these things, it threatens, for one, their profession or their ability to take their next, promotion. It becomes something that the more you make it an okay thing, the more you don't have to feel like you're putting up with something that's not okay. So you start to normalize it in some way. And I think that's what happens. And I think then the fear becomes, Brother Richard would say to me, people become afraid that it's going to affect their possibilities, their potential in their own job.
Their money, property, and prestige.
Exactly. Back to that 100%. And that the children, they have to believe they'll get over it. It's not a big deal. And what we're talking about is how big of a deal it really is. I am 68 years old. And I'm talking about being afraid. I'm talking about being afraid. And I know I'm afraid. And I know I'm afraid of things that are over. I know other survivors of this same situation, and we're only talking about this one situation, who haven't even told their families. They won't speak up about this because they're so terrified. This isn't just a one-off. This isn't something you can explain in your head. That's not going to, no. This is a system. I believe it is a systemic issue. And I believe that if you do not do something about it, if you cannot say, I'm a part of this system, not just I'm a part of the system, but we move these people around. We did things that we're not proud of. The system isn't just a system, it's made up of people. And those people are who we elected, or we brought in, or we shored up to be there. And then we look to them to be the rule, to be the decision makers. And the truth is, they're just doing whatever keeps them safe, keeps them happy, makes sure everybody whose colleagues aren't upset with them. I feel that this is a bigger problem. And just because Masco is dead, I don't care. Just because these people are from back then, there's a Attorney General's investigation going on around clerical abuse in Maryland. And it has been going on, it'll be 4 years in August. And a number of people have written books during that time, about how they lived through it and to help support survivors. What I find is that I've never once heard the police department, anyone in the higher up of the police department, stand up and say, this is horrendous that these police were involved in this. And what they stand behind, there's no proof. Well, what that says to me and any number of other survivors, you're lying. You've made this up. You're hysterical. Whatever it is, I don't know. But if I'm not proof by what I remember and the growth that comes from remembering it, then you're saying I'm not telling the truth. And I think that's a systemic problem. There's a problem that it covers things up, whether you want it to be covering things up or not. And I think it's across the board. And I think that it's because perpetrators know how to groom. They don't just groom the children. They're grooming other adults. My uncle would come in dropping us off, and he would stand with my mother and they would be talking. And my daughter's the one that helped me understand that conversation and him taking that time to look normal with my mother brought her into the relationship that he was having with me down there. Not knowing it, it's all subconscious. So I think perpetrators, just like anything, they get better at it. And I think the more that the higher ups don't do anything about it, what they're saying is it's okay as long as you don't get found out. It's okay as long as I don't get called to the rope for this. And, we'll just trust that it's over and it'll never happen again.
And it keeps happening. According to the Centers on Disease, CDC, 25%, and I think that they're probably being cautious, 25% of American women are molested as minors. And until people start taking responsibility, and until institutions don't put their money, power, and prestige first, we're going to have this pandemic in our society.
I think there's another part to that too. I think that statute of limitations.
Yes.
You know, the most recent statistic that I have is that people who've been, abused as children, don't normally, statistically speaking, they're 52. So let's look at that. 52, when they're finally, for whatever reason, the perpetrator might have died, maybe their parents have died, and they were always terrified that they would throw them out or disown them. Something's happened. And one of the things that you look at the statute of limitations, well, for Baltimore, for Maryland, it's the age of 38. So if you don't now report by the age of 38, you can't hold a perpetrator in a court of law. You cannot, file suit, hold them in some way accountable. Well, if they know, statistically speaking, these aren't statistics that are just willy-nilly, you already have set up a system that says a victim can't do anything. Because I can remember, I can come forward, I can do what I got to do, but I can't hold that person accountable.
The statute of limitations has to go.
100%.
If this is going to be adequately addressed. It's kind of interesting. There was a district court judge, Patrick Schills. He represented various archdioceses and ultimately adjudicated 500 cases of priest abuse. And then he became a judge, and he was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said of those 500 cases, he said that he thought less than 10% of the people were fabricating their abuse. And because you went through hell when you came forward, most survivors go through hell when they come forward because they're going to be attacked by very vicious lawyers. I mean,
right.
And the police are just going to call them crazy. I mean,
right.
You've had all of that, and I'm so happy that you had a family to stand behind you and love you as you've gone through this.
Right. Right. And it always makes me wonder, because I could have killed myself. I mean, it's why me? Why? I mean, I think most survivors would feel that. It's like, we know people who didn't make it, or are lost in, and it's like, why me? It just is that. It's like all of it. There are people who were in the building, in the school, and are dealing with survivor's guilt. I can dissect all those things. I can tell you what I think, but what this is really all about is protecting children. And when I think about being a child who was being sexually abused, we as adults need to understand that if we don't talk about this, children aren't going to hear us talking, that this is something worth talking about. They will wait until they're 52 years old to speak. And they need to somehow be hearing through people who have the courage and not through all the garbage and the ugliness. There's got to be ways that we're talking like elders that are saying that this isn't right. So children who are in the middle of this kind of thing can in some way speak to somebody, that they'll know they're not alone. So that's one thing that I feel really strong why I continue to do what I do. The other is that we as adults also need to understand that this is not just something that somebody does to a child. Even it doesn't matter. People will say to me, nothing compared to what you went through, but maybe they have never done X, Y, and Z. They have nightmares. It affects us all differently. The point is no adult has the right to put their hands on a child in an inappropriate way for any reason in any situation. They have no right. It should be criminal, period, no matter what your profession, no matter who you are, that is not acceptable in our society. It should just not be. That's my dream. But as a child, I can also say that they know what they're doing. And if you look at even an adult who's trying to say, this kid in me experienced this, the worst part was that I felt I was the one who had to prove myself. I felt like I had to explain myself. I felt like I was being judged. I felt like no one believed me until I could prove myself. And that is, then I can imagine if a child does speak to somebody, what are they going through? Why did they let it happen? How come? I had people say those kinds of things. I would have said, get the fuck off of me, and left. It's like, you have no idea what you would do unless you were in it. And being in it is a whole different ballgame. So I do think we have to be a little bit more accepting of children and encouraging of children, or we're going to end up with just always 52-year-old people who can't do anything about it but talk about it. And the kids are just going to keep on being abused. And then they're going to be living lives that are nothing to do with what they originally had wanted or could have done. That said, these people traffic it. I could never have used that word before because I didn't see it as that. They moved me around. He literally took me around in a car. They took us places in cars. He was, I see him as the pimp. He was prostituting. I know at least 2 times, 3 times where money exchanged. And so I feel that this is a serious situation that needs to be looked at. I don't know how you call it serious once they're all dead, but there's something about it that's so systemic that it has to be talked about in bigger arenas because it happened. You can't have as many people who remembered things separate from each other and not say that is the proof in itself. And that's what you were saying about Sharon May. It's like to decide not to use that. I understand legally there was no proof, like I had no paper that was, signed by somebody. But each of those people had an experience separate from each other. I never met Teresa until 2016. So it's not like, or 2015, whatever it was. That should be proof in itself. And that's what needs to change also, is that we look deeper than whatever it is that we have labeled proof and say, it should have been proof. When I heard Teresa's situation after the fact, I couldn't hear it before. I couldn't get over how it really legitimized my experience. That's when I felt supported by all those people. It was after I could hear it, after the decision was made, after their remembering wouldn't affect my memories. Then I could hear it. And that's when it had a powerful effect on me. So I do think that what a child goes through in these situations is far beyond what we could even imagine. And I did want to say, in light of that, I had also written another book right when The Keepers came out, and it's called Conversations with Myself. And what this was, when you talk about journaling, after my husband died in 2007, in 2009, there was like 3 different times I thought I would write a book. I had to write down the spiritual, psychological stuff that was going on. And I couldn't write. I can't journal the way I used to. It stifled me. But I started writing in these kind of like these, I will say poetry, but it's, if you're a poet, this isn't poetry. So before The Keepers came out, I was going to put these on my website, and my sister and my daughter said, don't do that. People will cut and paste them and put them in their Facebook pages and act like they're theirs. So I got Tom Nugent, who was a journalist who did the Inside Baltimore. His wife helped me put this little book together. And for those survivors that have repressed or dissociate, who know what it's like to carry ourselves in different parts and compartments. I just want to read this one paragraph, if it's okay with you, Nick.
Go for it.
This is what, after I had put these together, because you remember now, this is before the keepers. So a lot of these people wouldn't have understood, because none of this information even came out until I wrote the book, because, you know, Ryan was so good about not putting a whole bunch of horrible stuff in. He put what was relevant. So this is what I wrote. These pure conversations with my teen self can be disturbingly raw and painful to read. I feel that when I read them, I, however, was deeply changed, touching the depth of pain and suffering my younger self was sharing with me. It was a level of feeling I had been afraid to enter into. I could not separate my teen self from my present self in that horrible pain. There was no room for pretense. She was me. It will be impossible for me to ever again diminish the dehumanizing, torturous raping of my body, mind, and spirit by others. This is to say, if anyone's listening, and maybe journaling is being suggested by a therapist, or maybe there is dialoguing, active imaging that they are suggesting, maybe there's things that you've been feeling you want to try and do to access more of yourself. Find who you trust. And I can only say from my own experience, 30 years of doing a lot of this work, it has made all the difference. I feel that I have a love now for my parts and pieces. I'm still growing with the teenager, the one who lived after Cathy, but, or took over, carried it all, you know. But I don't think I've ever felt such acceptance and connection to myself, but for all this psychological and spiritual work that I have done. It's a hard choice, but I do believe that it has all been well worth it. And I just want to make sure people who are listening hear me say that. It can be very hard, and make sure you have the supports in place. But it did help me make it to this point.
Well, Jean, I want to thank you for being a guest on my podcast, and
Thank you.
for opening up about your life.
Thank you, Nick.
And it sounds like you're on the right road, that you're comfortable with the road you're on.
One step at a time.
Yes. Have yourself a great day.
Thank you, Nick. You too.